I guess, bringing us back to brains and minds and stuff, people are kind of settling for the mind being the brain, and that worries me, because I think, no, you're going to say that this part is going to stand in for the whole, and I don't think it will ever do that, because I don't think minds are individual. I don't think, rather like conversation, I think minds exist in the heads of individuals. If they were to, I don't know how interaction would be possible, which is why I would say that that part analysis won't work as the explanation for the whole. In most cases, it will always be partial. Now,
sure.
Partiality is fine, but I think it should be, we acknowledge that it's partial.
In our blog conversation, you've talked about the problems with a purely physical science of the world. Does that mean you're arguing for the existence of non-physical things? What's the contrast to physical in this sense?
Yes, I am. But then I accept, in terms of the way someone wants to look at the world physically, and materialism and all the answers and where that goes, including the idea of sending rovers to Mars and all the rest of it, that's fine. But no, not everything is physical. I mean, one of the examples I think we've talked about briefly is this idea of history. And I can remember when my wife and I went on a walk some time ago, and we crossed this field, and then we saw a sign that said about a battle that took place on this field. Now, the thing is, crossing that field, we had no idea what took place there hundreds of years ago. There's no remnants of it. I can imagine if it were to have been archaeologically dug over and all the rest of it, there's probably no artifacts there either. There's no physical evidence of anything. And yet, you wouldn't want to say, I don't think, that the battle didn't exist. I'm sure you'd say, well, the battle did exist, but all we might have today is an archive of that historical evidence. Historians may be arguing about the importance of it and who was there and how it transpired, based on other kinds of records, but that the record itself left is not physical, and it does rely, if you like, on humans to be able to decode it, read it, in a sense that is non-physical, I would say.
I mean, I expect a staunch materialist like myself might say that, okay, the battle physically happened, and the physical particles of light bouncing off it bounced onto physical eyes, which stored memories in physical brains, which, you know, prompted physical hands to write down physical records. But the problem with that is that just the word physical means everything. And I wouldn't really call myself a physicalist or materialist, except to contrast myself with a spiritualist or someone who believes in magic, I suppose. So, yeah, I'm not sure. We disagree. I think.
I mean, that's an example, but then that's an example of saying you'd have to stretch physicalism pretty hard if you want to include it in that. Now, you could, but I think you'd also think, well, there's probably other ways of coming at this. So there are, if you like, things like there's culture, there's society, there's the arts, there's history. There's lots of things that are not in natural sciences. Even science itself, of course, is not unitary. There may be natural sciences, there are social sciences, there are human sciences, life sciences. I mean, there's lots of ways you could cut this up. And again, I think our problem is to think that we would only look for one kind of solution. It's very effective, for sure. But then I'd say psychology, actually, over the years has been pretty effective because, I mean, it's just that we use it. Just because we all use it, and we don't all operate scanners, shouldn't downgrade it in terms of status.
I agree, yes, that the discipline should have equal status. I just wonder whether, a bit like the way Midgley is forced to talk about units, because that's what naturalist scientists would do, I wonder if you're forced to say that psychology isn't physical because you're accepting the terms of your antagonists in a way. I don't think that thoughts or cultures or societies are any more or less physical than the sorts of things that physicists talk about, like atoms or whatever. And once you, as I think Midgley's getting at with the patterns idea, once you say that all the sort of scientific objects we're talking about are patterns rather than stuffs, then this contrast between the physical and the non-physical disappears, really.
It would help. I think it would help us, because it would, well, for a start off, it would get us into more interesting questions, I think, about dynamic relations between things when we get stuck with atomistic ways of thinking about units. You know, we just think about an individual brain as if that will answer anything to do with psychology, and of course it's nonsense. We need to look at what people do and what people do together and with each other, and if that sort of thing is not going to be given in any individual brain. So, but I would turn back to your thing about psychology. I mean, psychology is one of the things that's not unitary. It's probably the least unitary discipline, and in some ways it's saving grace, actually. It's been described as a broad church, and by its members who defeated people who at the top at one time of the British organisation were trying to change this, because people like the idea that it's full of psychoanalytic people as well as neuroscientists. So you have neuropsychologists, but you also have social psychologists, cognitive, developmental. I mean, you have so many that it's almost impossible to name. There are something like 30 odd kind of sections, if you like, in that way to the discipline.
Oh, but there's half a dozen kinds of neuroscience, or dozens of kinds of neuroscience, aren't there? All sciences splinter into
This isn't a
groups.
splintering, this is the fact that it's acknowledged. And the funny thing is that people try and produce new kind of areas, if you like, or think these areas are something on their own all the time. And I think there is a justification in saying that it's not a splintering, it's a recognition that some part is not being addressed. And I'd say that's what gets me going, because I come back to saying, well, I don't think you're addressing the social, psychological issues. I think you keep forgetting it. And that's what I do. That's my job, in a way, to keep doing that. Because I'm, at heart, I suppose, I'm a social psychologist. So I will always go from there. But I recognise social psychological weakness. I recognise its partiality, and I wouldn't expect it to be able to address everything, all and everything.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that.
Nor would I expect social neuroscience to take over. It's not going to do that. Why is it not going to do that? Because it doesn't address the same things. It can't.
Okay, so closing question. I wondered if perhaps you could tell us a bit about your book, Acts of Consciousness, for Cambridge University Press.
Yes. One of the things about this is an opportunity to do largely one of the things we've been talking about, really, which is, instead of arguing against lots of things, is to argue for a particular position and let people hear it, let people test their own ideas against a particularly strong kind of vision, if you like. So what this book has allowed me to do, and I'm amazed that it's going to get published, is to put my standpoint on in terms of consciousness, and where I think it's important issues that have not really been spoken about. One of the things, I suppose, in relation to this is the idea that that the person is important where consciousness is concerned, and although other ways you can come at consciousness, I would say this is an area that has been missed hugely. And although there are people at conferences trying to do things like this, it has been marginalised heavily, and I would like to see it have as much state and status as, say, neuroscience. So the person, I think, is important when we want to understand consciousness. One of the things about this is to think the person is what I would say is polyphonic. Now, that word is unfortunate, but there's not many ways of coming at this, I suppose. The idea is that we're not unitary, and the social is not unitary. Persons are best understood as being polyphonic, so that we are multiply voiced. And one of the things about this is to get away from maybe the idea of looking at inside and outside and say, well, there's a convenient way of drawing a line here. People want to say there's a world out there, and then there's a person in here. So world out there, person in here. And I'm going, no. I mean, for a start off, you could actually start the other way around and go world out there, person, world in here, person out there. Would make as much sense, really. Because clearly one of the things...
None.
Well, only in the sense that the thing is, to get a person started, and one of the things I'm arguing is the person doesn't start from birth. I mean, it's not something you could say is just in there, because in social terms, it's just not possible. I mean, you have to be engaged in life and living to acquire this, and to be with people. People make people like themselves. That's one of the kind of arguments in the way this is done. So the thing is, what looks out from behind your eyes is made. It's already made. It's not private and individual in that sense to you. It's actually formed up from the many voices of those who, I mean, people know this, but they don't like it because it sounds as if it's sort of a sort of form of insanity, because what people normally associate with many voices is the idea of some kind of multiple personality. Now, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the person isn't unitary in one sense, that there's you located there in this room talking to me now, but that what makes you a person are all the interactions with other people that you have had. Probably a funny thing in Cubism is the idea of looking at things as multiply organized. It's not such an unusual idea, but it gets us away from both units and patterns in a way, because it actually says that the complexity is real, and that addressing things from the complexity is not impossible. People always want to move away from that to something simpler, and I'm saying no, actually sometimes the complexity is your starting point. You need to start from that social point of view.
Dr. Guy Saunders, thanks very much.
Thank you, Joe.